I'll do that. Now, a landmark study looking into the effect of domestic violence on women's mental health has found that victims of abuse are 3 times more likely than other women to develop mental illnesses, including schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. The study by experts at the University of Birmingham analysed the medical records of almost 100,000 women over more than 20 years. It's the first time researchers have followed women's experience from the point at which they suffered abuse to the development of a mental illness. The researchers say opportunities to spot the warning signs of abuse are being missed, and they're calling for improved screening and record keeping. Well, we can talk now to Emma Armstrong. She is a domestic abuse survivor who suffered from mental health issues. She now works at Reigate and Banstead Women's Aid Refuge. We're also joined by Dr. Jyot Singh Chandan, who was the lead author on the study, and Dr. Beena Rajkumar, co-chair of the Women's Mental Health Special Interest Group at the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Welcome all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll come to you first of all, Dr. Jyot Singh Chandan, just to tell us more about the research that you've done and how clear the link is that you've established in your study between domestic abuse and serious mental illness.
Absolutely. So firstly, good morning to all the listeners and viewers, and thank you very much for inviting me this morning to talk about the study. I think one of the most important things to highlight to begin with is that unfortunately domestic abuse is still a hugely prevalent problem within the UK. Estimates from the crime survey last year thought that actually individuals or women, approximately 1 in 4 women within the UK may have experienced domestic abuse at some point in their life, which is why we felt that this piece of research was extremely important to undertake. As you had mentioned, what we did was conduct essentially a long piece of research where we followed at women at the point of exposure of domestic abuse and followed them to the point of developing a mental illness and compared them to women who did not have the exposure to domestic abuse. The key highlights or the key findings of our study was actually that 1, women who had experienced domestic abuse were 3 times more likely to go on to develop a mental illness. 2, the women who had experienced domestic abuse at the point of study entry or the point of them being recorded as experiencing domestic abuse were also 3 times more likely to have had a recorded mental illness diagnosis. And 3, probably the greatest problem that we did identify, is that there is a huge level of underreporting or under-recording of domestic abuse within primary care or within GP records.
I was going to ask you about that because when you talk about following people from the start of them being in a situation where they are being subjected to abuse, obviously part of why people stay in it and tolerate certain things is because they're not really aware necessarily that what they're being subjected to is unacceptable and is abuse. So and they're not necessarily talking to other people about it.
Absolutely, and if anything, that is probably one of the key findings of the study, that unfortunately we have groups of very vulnerable women who are being subjected to abuse, and the question is, and actually one of the key highlights of the study is are there any opportunities for us to help those vulnerable women before they actually end up being exposed to domestic abuse?
Thank you. Well, that's a question we can talk about, Emma, because you've suffered domestic abuse yourself and you had mental health issues, and I know that you now work with other women going through the same to help them. What are your thoughts when you hear Dr. Jyot talking there about trying to, I suppose, identify the issues early on and avoid women having to go through it and developing the mental health issues that then seem to be inevitably coming for so many?
So I think for me, being a survivor, I was in an abusive relationship for 6 years, and at the point where I left, I didn't actually realise, I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't know it was domestic abuse. I didn't know it was sexual abuse. A lot of it was still unknown to me. I think had somebody had said to me at the time, are you safe? You know, do you feel safe when you're with your partner? I would have been able to say, no, I don't. And I think maybe that question would have been something that would have helped me seek help earlier. As a result of it, I didn't feel like I had enough awareness of domestic abuse at the time. And I feel like I stayed in the relationship for a number of reasons, not just that, but for me it was the fear of leaving the abusive relationship because my partner used suicides and attempted suicides as a way to keep me there. And on the last occasion when I did leave him, he successfully committed suicide. So for me it was mainly the fear of having his death on my conscience that kept me in there. But I think if somebody had said to me, do you feel safe? It would have been an easy question for me to answer, which was no.
And at what point do you think mental health issues started to come to the fore for you, because you were in a situation that you were tolerating and you were saying that you weren't looking at yourself as a victim in that context, that came later when you looked back and thought, gosh, that's what I
Yeah, it was
what I
definitely
went
only
through.
after leaving him. I knew that I didn't have much self-esteem and confidence, but again, at the time, you are so paralysed with what's going on when you're in an abusive relationship. It is so powerful. It takes control of every part of you that you can't even think straight. So for me, it was after I left the abusive relationship and started work at the refuge, I realised my self-esteem was gone. You know, I had no confidence. I was really struggling with PTSD, so I suffered horrendously with nightmares, flashbacks. So I did then rely heavily on the GP and say, you know, I needed help. But it was only after I left the relationship that I realised how severely I had been affected.
Can you see at all how things could have been different? Because you were in a situation that, you know, you, as you say, you were kind of, you felt trapped, and you look back and you can understand it looking back, but at any point early on, could someone else have, I don't know, done something different? Could you, what?
I mean, I definitely think there is room for improvement in terms of educating people around domestic abuse. I think that sadly, too often victims are blamed for staying in an abusive relationship. And
People say, why didn't you just leave?
Exactly, why didn't you leave? I wouldn't let somebody do that. And you know, if I'm being honest, I was that person too when I was younger, before I fell into an abusive relationship.
So explain then, for people that do look at it like that and think that, I wouldn't tolerate that, and as you say, you were like that, how it ends up that you do find yourself trapped in a situation.
You lose complete control. The control, everything from the way you think, the way you feel, the way even you just get up in the morning is controlled by that person. And for me and for many other victims, we live in fear. We live in fear of doing everything we can to ensure that we don't create the next kick-off, because at the time you're made to believe that it is you that is causing that to happen, and it's your fault that you are being treated that way. So you do everything you can in your power just to almost smooth it over and try and keep yourself safe and everybody around you safe as well.
Dr. Beena Rajkumar, are you surprised at all by anything that this report has shown up? I mean, it seems like it would be an obvious link, obviously, that mental illness arising from being in a very challenging domestic situation.
Not at all. To be quite honest, I haven't found the results of this study surprising at all. As a frontline psychiatrist working with women who have complex mental health needs, this is something that I see all the time, the devastating impact of domestic abuse on mental health. If you think about it, when somebody's subjected to coercion and compulsive experiences like what Emma was talking about, it affects their self-esteem, their confidence, and that they become quite isolated because they lose the ability to trust people, and that makes them vulnerable to developing mental health problems, including complex PTSD that Emma was talking about, depression, serious mental illness. And yeah, so the study itself hasn't been surprising. What was surprising, however, is the extent to which general practices are missing the opportunity to spot domestic abuse and to really make an intervention. I think that's surprising, and that's a wake-up call for us.
A lot of people don't talk about it because either they don't really understand what's going on, or sometimes people will say by talking about it, it kind of makes it real, and then it's something that you've got to deal with. So no doubt there are people going to their GP, going through this, and it would be hard for the GP to spot because they're not talking about what's actually really going on in their lives, and maybe symptoms are showing in a different way. So what would you say could be done if there's somebody in that context? How could a GP help? How could anybody around that person help?
As you said, women don't talk about it for understandable reasons that Emma was talking about. That's the nature of domestic abuse. So I think we as professionals, the onus is on us to make sure we are asking the questions. We are absolutely asking the questions, and we are not just asking the questions, but we know how to ask the questions, and we know what to ask. In general practice, people ask about smoking, about alcohol consumption, because of the impact that it has on physical health. Similarly, we must ask about domestic abuse as a screening question because of the impact it has on mental health. And it's also about knowing how to ask and what to ask, so that there's no, we take a trauma-informed approach, which is moving away from what's wrong with you, which is filled with judgment, and which is filled with blame, to saying what happened to you, which is filled with empathy and which is and validation. And I think that's very, very important, because that's a very powerful position.
Yeah, definitely.
And Emma, I mean, it's obviously the GPs have a role. The family and friends around somebody as well can play a role. You said about, you know, some people sort of say, why would you? I'm not talking about your personal situation, but in, you know, in any situation, why would you stay? Why would you put up with that? What should the people around somebody who is going through this be doing? What
I
should they
think
be
just
saying?
listen and, you know, show an offering ear and ask the questions. Are you okay? You know, do you want to talk? For victims, they will only leave when they are ready to leave, and nobody else will have a control over that, unfortunately. I think it's just about being patient and supporting that person to say, you know, I'm here if you want to talk. Do you want to talk? I mean, for me with the GP, I didn't actually disclose anything to my GP until after he had committed suicide, because I was so afraid that the police would get involved. So I think raising not just awareness for family and friends, but educating everybody in society that domestic abuse is happening. It's still affecting 1 in 4 women. That's a huge statistic, and everybody can say, you know, it doesn't happen in this area, but actually it does. It could happen to anyone. So let's raise awareness, let's talk about it, let's have the conversations around domestic abuse.
Thank you all very much indeed for joining us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Dr. Jyot Singh Chandan, Dr. Beena Rajkumar and Emma Armstrong. Thank you. Thank you very much.